With Zoom is you have to get used to where everything is hiding because it hides. I hope you can see. Yes, it says I'm screen sharing. So I hope you can see the screen. I've got two things that I wanted you to notice. One is this web page, which has two tables in it. And the important feature of these two tables is the fact that there's a lot of what you would call, if you were looking at it in a Excel sheet, is a lot of merging. Um, the exercise said three tables. So I'm sorry about the three tables. Yeah, it looks like three tables, but it's actually two. And yeah, there's not another one with that. If you want to do this without any borders, you can, but basically the third table would be the same as this table, but without borders. So we'll just leave it at two tables. So yeah, because in this diagram, I mean, sorry, in this instructions, it looks like three tables, 1, 2, 3. But in fact, the first table and the second table are exactly the same, except for the second table has added some borders. So I hope that clears that up. Right. So we really just got two tables, and it's better with the borders because with the borders we can actually see the cells that have been merged. And when I use the word merge here, that's a term that you might be familiar with your Excel spreadsheets or even with your Word tables. But in the tables that we use with HTML, we use row span and column span to achieve that. So in this table, what we've actually got is we've got 5 rows and 5 columns. But in many of the cells, the rows and the columns have been spanned. I'll use that word instead of merge. So in this first cell here, what we have is column 1, nothing changed, but in row 1 and row 2, we have a span. So there's a row span there between row 1 and row 2 for the first column. Then we have row 3. Then row 4 and row 5 are also spanned. So there's 5 rows, but in the first column, we got a row span there, and we got a row span there. Then in our second column, we actually have a column span for column 2 and column 3 for the first row. So row 1 does a column span there. Row 1 does a row span there, and then a column span there. Then if we go across to row, so that's row 1 still, column 1, column 2, column 3. Then column 4, well, that's got another row span so that row 1 and 2 are both spanned into that there for the first cell in the first row. Then row 1, column 5, it's left untouched. Then the other things where we have some spanning is in the last 2 rows, the column 1 is spanned. And then in the last 2 columns, there's a column span, and there's also a row span for 3 rows. Then our next example, which it refers to as third example, is actually a table with 2 rows. And the first column has a row span on it for the 2 rows. And the last column has a row span on it for the 2 rows. And the center column does not. But the trick that you've got some added work in the last table because you have to do some background coloring and you have to do some padding and margins to keep the text away from the edges of the table. And the table, and so that's why we have this white stuff there too. And the table borders have to be made sort of white or non-visible, depending on how you look at that. All right, so let's have a look at that, how that is achieved in the HTML. Okay, so I'm going to show you Notepad++. We've been using Visual Studio Code because I was convinced by teachers of the second and third year courses to get you used to that because you'll be using that in second and third year courses. However, you may find in the classroom where you're going to do your test next week, I'm not sure what the software is, and talking to some of the other teachers, there might not be Visual Studio Code there. And if there's not, you will be able to find pad plus plus, and I think you'll see it works pretty much the same. It's pretty similar. All right, so we got our two tables here. The first table and the second table, they can be differentiated. So there's our first table. Our second table, we use an ID so that we can differentiate it from the first table. So table 2 is called, when I say differentiate it, we use the ID so that we can access that table in the CSS and treat it differently than the first table. And that's important because we got these different colors and the different way of doing the border and all of that. So let's look at the first table. Like I said, there's 5 rows. I hope you can see the 5 rows there. All right. Now, some of the rows have more columns than others, and that's because when you get a row span in one row, the following row is going to have the column where that row span was will not need to be put there. So what we find is in the first column of the first row, we've got a row span. So in the second row, that column is not mentioned. Now, in the when we have a column span, what we find is that in that current row, we don't mention that we have one less column. So I told you that the table is made up of 5 rows and 5 columns, but the first row only mentions 4 columns, and that's because this thing here is actually all just one column. Other and category, you'll see it's just one column. There's a BR between it, but you can see column 1, column 2, column 3, and column 4. Do any of these have 4 columns? All 5 columns mentioned? Let's have a look at the table. I actually, none of them do. Well, hold on. Column 2 actually has all. Well, no, because column 2, row 2, the first column is missing, and because it's been spanned, and the fourth column is missing because it's been spanned. So if you look at row 2, it's very short. It only has 2 columns, which are height and weight. Height and weight. Other category has been spanned out from the previous row, and the 5th column is just missing. Okay, so how does that code look? It looks like that. There's our first row. We've got 2 row spans in it. This cell here is made by a row span, and this cell here is made by a row span. Okay, so, and it has a column span in which the average is going over 2 columns. So that's how that's achieved in that one. Then the following row, we don't need to mention the first column because it's spanned by in the first row. And so all we mention is the height and the weight. We don't need to mention this because it's also spanned in the first column, in the first row. Then the next row, we've got, well, what? We've got a row span for 3 columns, for 3 rows, and a column span for 2 columns. And that's both in the same detail, which is the detail which has the very important information. And see the very important information, we put that over 3 lines, but in the same cell. And so that's this thing here, the very important information. The only thing that makes the very on top of the important on top of the information is those BRs. But that's all one cell. So it is done by column spanning 2 columns and row spanning 3 rows. And so that's what's happening in the third row. Then in the fourth row, we put the 2 types of monkeys together in one column, and that's 2 rows put into one row, spanned to one. The height and weight data is not changed, but then we're going to ignore that. So the last input will be this 32. And that's what you see there. It's very little amount of information because the spanning in the first and the spanning at the end. I hope that makes sense. The next table is just 2 rows and 3 columns. And so the first row is going to have all of this stuff in it that I'm highlighting, all of that stuff with 2 row spans. The last row is only going to have one little bit of data because everything else has already been put in. And so you can see that here, I hope. So here's the first row of that table. That includes all of that data. And you see the row span for the first column. It gets all that stuff in. And then you have the second column, just a little bit of stuff, and then the row span for the third column. Then the last row only has one bit of data in it because it only needs one, which is this pink thing. So there's a row span there, there's a row span there, and this is the second row is just that. And then there's a whole lot of other important stuff going on with this in terms of getting background colors. So we're using IDs to indicate each of those bits of data or parts of the table. I notice also the captions. The caption, it's actually part of the table, but it's sort of before we do the rows. So we got a caption on this table and we got a caption on this table. And that's part of the table. It's inside the table tags, but it's before we do the rows. And so that's, I hope that's not too hard. Yeah, then yeah, so this one is one big row that goes that has all that data in it. We got a row span for the first column and a row span for the last. Now, as I said, we're using these IDs here so that we can do our coloring of the backgrounds, but also we have to work with the border, and we have to work with the color we have to work with the border, and we have to work with the padding. And that's what you can see there, right? So in the second table, we needed to get some spacing on the border so that we got this white, 8 pix white between. All right, so that's done that way. We had to make it colorless. So even though it's black, we made it 0 pix. And the padding of 6 pix, that keeps the words away from the edges of the cells in which they are. Now, I'm more or less given you most of the, almost all of the code there, if you've been watching that video. But what I want you to do, remember, when you hand in your work, you need to put your name and your ID in the file. So in the head, you'll need to put a title, and in the title, that should be your name in there, right? Oh, I think if I tab, no. Title, did I type? Yeah. I shouldn't have to do that. I mean, I see why you guys like visual code, because you wouldn't need to do that. So you're going to put your name there, right? And your number. And you should also put a heading in here, right? Put a H1 or something. And put your name and your name.
Sir, I have a question.
Yes, I'm listening.
Is it because for the last lab 2, I didn't put my name or number,
Yeah,
or is it only for this lab?
it should be for every lab, but I forgot about it last lab.
Oh, okay, okay.
It's my mistake
So
that
from this lab, we have to put our name and ID
yeah,
number, right?
do that, yes. Just so I know
Okay,
that
perfect.
you're at least touching it. I mean,
Okay, sir. Okay.
otherwise it'd be too easy just to copy the stuff around. I don't want you to do
Yeah.
that.
Okay.
All right,
Yeah.
so
Sure. No. No problem.
so that's